Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for March 31st, 2015. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today I'm joined by Jim Clausing online. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks.
So it was good to see you last week, and you look more like a camera lens this week. So nevertheless, glad to have you.
Yeah, it was fun being there, but now I'm back in my cave again.
And welcome. Matt Kaiser. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks, Brian. How's it going?
And you're still here in person.
Still here. Never left.
And Stan Nurilov. Welcome, Stan.
Thanks, Brian.
It's good to see you here. I'm Brian Rexroad, and let's get right to it here. And Stan, I guess you have the first story here. And go ahead, start.
Well, there's an interesting article in IB Times, a UK publication online. It says that, claims that Russia is emerging as a cyber threat. Mm-hmm. And is playing some sort of like a long game in the cyberwar campaign. They kind of list a few countries that have emerged as big threats in the cyber threat landscape, and mm-hmm. they talk about in the it's an interesting article. First of all, it's got a lot of interesting points. But I guess one thing that it tries to bring up is this Russian cyber threat, and mm-hmm. something that I don't think was widely reported in the past. Most people have always associated APT with China for some mm-hmm. reason. But this article focuses on Russia and North Korea and Iran a little bit.
So are there what do they mean by a long game?
I think what they're trying to say is that they kind of have not released their full capability. Mm-hmm. So I think the article, in citing some sources, is saying that they have a lot of capability. They're in a big economy. Mm-hmm. They throw a lot of resources towards the cyber threat. Well, they suspect that they throw a lot of resources mm-hmm. towards the cyber program, but they haven't seen a lot of very complex malware yet, or it hasn't been published or talked about widely. Mm-hmm. And so they think that they're kind of holding off their best tactics,
mm-hmm.
And they're just using what they can when they need to. One interesting thing they mentioned, we can only speculate if it's true or not, is that let's say the Russian government was actually sponsoring something, they would actually do it through hackers. Mm-hmm. So a third party might be actually doing the cyber threat, mm-hmm. But not the government itself.
Mm-hmm. So I think we've seen that kind of thing before, or at least there's been discussion about that kind of thing before, where presumably another organization, perhaps an independent group or a contractor per se, might be actually doing the attacks. And then I think there have even been stories that have described almost the inverse of that attackers have gone out sort of in an entrepreneurial sense, gone out and tried to gather information, steal intellectual property, and perhaps are selling it back to whoever might be interested in it. And if it happens to be information that a nation state might want, they might purchase that.
Yeah, exactly. Which makes me think that it almost doesn't matter what kind of who the threat actor is necessarily. Mm-hmm. If you got one on your network, any kind, from a simple crime gang related activity or financial malware, it's probably best to just get it off your network as soon as possible.
Yeah, I agree with that. But by the same token, I think it kind of matters to understand a little bit who you're dealing with. And we kind of pointed out sometimes it's very difficult to determine who might be attacking you, but there are sort of indicators, the type of malware they're using, some of the tools and the techniques that they're using, and what they're going after might provide it. And I think that's sort of inverse as well. That is, if you have some idea what the group might be, what might be motivating them, you might have some idea where they'd be going or what systems you need to protect better against that type of threat. And I think there's some value in that.
Yeah, well, definitely, I think in the crucial steps of incident response, when you don't mm-hmm. have a lot of time to think about it, if you do know where the threat is coming from, it can kind of help make your plan a little bit better of how to approach the incident. Mm-hmm. Like you said, where are you going to focus your protections? What kinds of things should you watch out for? Are they going to come in and destroy your network, or are they going to try to stay low and kind of hide out, mm-hmm. beaconing once in a while? So, yeah, like you said, it does matter in terms of understanding what kind of threat they might present you with.
Mm-hmm. I think James Clapper was mentioned in that article, right?
Yes.
And I think he was, he's the director of national intelligence and for the United States, even though it's a UK article. I think they were quoting him, and he's come out. There's a national threat assessment report that comes out each year. And they basically reported this year, they put cyber threats at the top of the list in terms of national security concerns, and then followed that with basically indicating that Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran were the primary nation states that we should be concerned about. And I think there are demonstrations of that sort of thing. You know, I had the opportunity to see James Clapper speak at the International Conference on Cybersecurity in January, and that's basically a co-sponsored activity. It's with the FBI and Fordham University. It's a pretty good conference. James Comey spoke there as well. He's the director of FBI, and at that time, this was before the National Threat Assessment Report. It was all about North Korea. You know, it was basically the point where in fact, that was where they came out to say that they think North Korea was the perpetrator behind the attacks against Sony. And so it was, there was a lot of discussion about it at the time, and that made it in the press. It was, it's a good conference if anybody has the opportunity to go to it. In particular, if you're local to the New York City area, it's one that's convenient as well. So one of the few that happens to be on the East Coast in the dead of winter. In fact, but a good conference nevertheless. Any thoughts from you, Jim?
Years back, it was mostly criminal activity coming out of Russia, and then it moved to Ukraine, and the capability of the nation state is always something that, in the back of my mind, they've got a large military. They can funnel a lot of money into it. So I don't doubt that there is some truth to what they're saying in the article, that they've been sitting on some of their capabilities and not using it. Hopefully they won't use it.
Yep, that's true. And I think in a lot of I think there are generally two types of threats. Sometimes they don't get distinguished very well. One is industrial espionage, and there certainly is evidence of industrial espionage taking place, and there have been some exchanges of accusations around that. The other one would be, I guess, this notion of cyber Pearl Harbor, the notion of setting up an attack. And I think, in fact, one of the topics they talk about in that article is this idea that, the attack, if there were ever to be such an attack, it's not going to just happen overnight. There's a lot of establishing footholds, ground to be able to do that. And that's one of the things that is sort of a subtlety in the nation-state attacks. They may establish a foothold and the intent would be to stay invisible, to not necessarily steal any information, just to establish that foothold, and do it in a lot of places, so that if they want to pull the trigger, they've already, it's kind of like laying landmines against your enemy, so that if they try to cross the line, it's they're already and waiting for them. So, okay, so on a lighter note, Jim, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about. I guess there have been actually discussions about nation-state threats using hotels as a means to basically get to specific targets. I don't know if this is actually related, but perhaps you can fill us in.
This was an article that I saw on Cylance's blog late last week. There was an announcement that a particular brand of internet gateway for visitor-based networks, it's commonly used in hotels and convention centers and places like that, it had a vulnerability that was pretty serious. They had unauthenticated access to an rsync daemon that would give you basically access to the entire system. And this was reported to the vendors of the systems not too long ago, but recently enough, and they have provided a patch. But one of the things that was pointed out in this blog post was, if they did manage to get root access to these devices, they may actually have access to more than just the the web traffic or whatever, the Wi-Fi traffic in the hotel. These devices are often integrated into the property management system. So that's the software that is used to coordinate all of the operational functions, front office, sales, planning. It can have reservation stuff, point of sale stuff, phone stuff, account receivable, marketing, all kinds of stuff, HR, payroll, could all be part of this property management system. And that's really the scary part is that, with this unauthenticated access to these gateways, they could then have access to a lot of sensitive personal information. Now, fortunately, there was a patch that was supposed to have been released on March 26th. I have not verified that it is actually out, that fixes it. And the other simple fix for it is to block inbound access to the rsync port, with a IP tables type rule or something. So it was okay. Yeah, I just found it. The vulnerability was reported to US Cert on February 12th, and they coordinated with the vendor. So the patch was scheduled to be released on the 26th.
Okay. So what is the rsync port? Do you recall?
In this case, rsync was running on port 873, TCP port 873.
Well, that should be pretty innocuous to block that port, don't you think?
Yeah.
Certainly
and
from the internet.
One of the researchers here did a scan of looking for that port across the internet and found a number of them that were directly accessible from the internet, which is not such a good thing.
Right.
Right.
Okay. Well, I think this is a good example, and as you were pointing out, that it doesn't really matter. I mean, it does matter. Any device that's connected to the network, or certainly if it's accessible from the internet, is one that you need to be paying attention to because it could become a gateway into other things. If we reflect back on the target attacks, that ultimately was actually through a third-party vendor HVAC system that they ended up being able to get access into the target enterprise network and then ultimately get into their point-of-sale systems to perform those credit card thefts and the theft of customer information. And so there really needs to be, I think, on one hand, you want to make sure you have some understanding of what your perimeter is, but on this, I guess the second part of it is we always want to build in layers. Make sure that there are protections if that first boundary is breached, and to be able to protect the rest of the environment. And the notion of our partitioning networks or partitioning off applications certainly is an important part of a good security architecture, right?
So
Stan's nodding yes.
I'm just curious if was a really good reason for the rsync port to be open on this device in the first place, or is this just a case of poor configuration management, where the vendor should have shut this before they shipped the product?
That's a good question. It may have been, I'm just going to take a wild guess, perhaps they had some type of a high reliability function to be able to sync across the devices and keep them synchronized in terms of configuration. That would be a valid reason for it, but obviously you want to design that into it. There's a possibility that in some of the installations they didn't know about the feature or weren't paying attention to that functionality or the concerns that it could generate. And I'm just guessing, but that would be one.
Yeah, it isn't clear what the purpose of it was. The high availability is a good possibility, but even then, it should have been authenticated. Use our SSH private keys or something like that to lock it down. This was unauthenticated, so. That was a misconfiguration of some sort. Yeah. As I said, I don't know what the original purpose was, but anything that's got access to, the root of the file system as root with no authentication is not a good thing.
Good point. Okay, so Stan, let's go back to you here. And so, we're always kind of studying denial of service attacks. This one gives a little new twist, at least from my perspective.
Yeah. Well, the another thing I'm always studying is use of proxies and things like that, and proxies in general. So this is where the two worlds collide. An article, I think, in CSO Online talked about how, I guess there was a study conducted a few years ago where some of the DDoS attacks, application-based DDoS attacks, were coming from proxy nodes. For example, one such would be like a Tor exit node or something like that, or other anonymously available free proxies or even maybe paid proxies. But now, when they've done the study, they're saying that it's maybe as much as 20%, so a fifth of all of these application layer DDoS attacks are happening through the use of proxies. And I think when we were preparing the report today for the internet weather, I think we have something there on the statistics on the use and scanning for proxies and things like that. But it certainly explains a little bit on, people are always trying to find proxies. What's the reason for that? Maybe they're trying to have more anonymous browsing of the internet, or maybe they're trying to, commit these kinds of DDoS attacks using the proxies. So it's an interesting article. There's some statistics there. Something like, I think they were saying 40% of the proxy traffic comes from actually Tor exit nodes, and then of that, 65 uses a specific type of attack over Tor or a specific type of tool over Tor.
Was Tor Hammer,
I think so, yeah.
Right. So when you say application level attacks, can you distinguish what makes it application versus
That's a good point.
something else?
I guess that refers to the network stack. So there's some attacks where you just send a packet, and it doesn't matter if the receiving, it doesn't matter if you've established a connection. It just, the packet goes and it does its thing, and that by itself may cause a DOS attack. Or there could be an attack where you're just overwhelming the bandwidth or something like that, or some of these, basically a bandwidth-based attack. And other application-based attacks is when you connect through the network, so you establish the TCP session. And it's probably the only kinds of attacks that can use a proxy, really, because you got to connect to the proxy, and the proxy has to connect to the application. So it'll be like a web server or something like that. And one type of attack might be, you connect to the web server and you wait a little bit more than a usual user would before sending packets or information. And if you do that enough, there's potential for resource usage and a denial of service.
So if you're going through a proxy, you're not going to be able to control the TCP session setup itself.
Right.
So you wouldn't be able to do a SYN attack, for example.
Right.
And we talk a lot about reflection attacks. That's probably out of scope in this case, in most circumstances anyway. But it's a case where once you've set up that TCP session, you can just send a packet.
Right.
Because the proxy is just relaying packets at that point, right? And then send a packet. And then send a packet. And so it holds the session up, and if you can do that thousands of times, it would tend to create a resource exhaustion, perhaps in the firewall on the front end of an application where it's trying to keep state, or on the application itself where it's trying to keep state of the sessions themselves.
And you're also building some sort of anonymity around yourself being, not exposing your own IP address space. You're coming in through somewhere else, and if there was some sort of investigation, it would always point back to these proxies. So there's something there for the attackers to hide their presence. Actually, it made me think, just while we're talking, about another type of attack that was using proxies, where this doesn't exist anymore, but it was an interesting twist. People were able to log in. I think it was to also web proxies. But when they issued the connect command, they were able to connect not over port 443 like you would normally do, or port 80. They would connect over like port 25 or these other ports, and actually send spam via like a SSL proxy.
Right.
So the use of proxies has been around for a long time to enable this kind of malicious activity.
Yeah, it's interesting the increase here. I think generally speaking, we've noticed that denial of service attacks have gone up significantly. There's been a lot of commercialization, and I kind of wonder to what extent some of this activity is related to commercialization as well. I think they also mentioned how inexpensive it is effectively to be able to generate generate a lot of sources of the activity, and there can be subtleties that you can build into it that each of the proxies is just a little bit different, or different proxy services or different proxies if you're just scanning around and finding them, that might make it a little more difficult for the mitigators to be able to generate a signature that blocks all of it or be able to track it. So also attributes that from attacker's point of view, a good thing, something that the mitigation services will need to be aware of to be able to do a good job doing that mitigation.
It's also a little harder to detect in general if you're looking from a network standpoint. I mean, basically you're seeing very, very low volume of traffic where you typically expect massive amounts of traffic. That would be your first tip off that you're under a DDoS attack. With a situation like this, if you're not monitoring the processes on your server, you're not going to know there's even an attack going on until your admins call you up and say, we've got this problem, we have no idea how to deal with it. All of a sudden, all of the threads in Apache are completely pegged. What is this?
Yeah, it may not be a full network resource exhaustion that occurs.
And it most likely won't be.
Right. Yeah, I can't even tell you how many times I've run into situations where folks aren't really paying attention to what's happening on their network until something gets pegged. Yep. Something goes down and they start investigating, well, the CPU's pegged or our network's running at 90%, and then everything's an attack after that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it used to be that stuff was there, but they didn't realize it was there because it was, there may be something that kicked it over the edge, and then everything's an attack after that. So it takes a little while to get used to what the rhythm is and, what types of activity you normally see that just aren't normal. I mean, not things that you would expect to see on a network, but they're certainly there. So all good things. The bad stuff's not good things, but good things to be aware of. Okay, Jim, I guess you get the privilege of talking about all the little holes in things today. And I guess we're not just blowing smoke here, right?
Yeah, it is. On March 17th, the Industrial Control Systems Cert, part of US Cert, released an advisory about a cross-site request forgery vulnerability in the operating system of a certain brand of wind turbine. Now, cross-site request forgery is an attack where, a malicious, website or email or whatever can cause a user's web browser to perform an unwanted action on the trusted site. And so this cross-site request forgery vulnerability in these wind turbines would allow an attacker to get username and password and potentially change the default user password in the web management interface of these wind turbines. Now, what exactly they can do with that, I don't know. Shut them down, probably. Not sure what else malicious you would necessarily be doing there. But these wind turbines are apparently in use in a number of countries. I think the vendor said they believe they're in use in like 29 countries or something like that around the world. So, and there is a patch available, needs to be manually applied, but there's a patch available to it. But it's another one of these situations where these industrial control systems, just like a lot of stuff we talk about on this show, probably shouldn't be directly exposed to the internet. At best, they should be, in their own protected network, VPN or whatever. These are just not the kinds of things, wind turbines, electric meters, all of this industrial control system kind of stuff really shouldn't be directly visible to the internet.
Yeah, so this could actually be a safety hazard, is that correct? I mean, if you can control the speed of the turbine, get it over spec, is that a possibility in this scenario?
That's a possibility. It's not clear to me what exactly all of the capabilities are through the web interface, but apparently the default user via that web interface has administrative access. They've got complete control. So yeah, potentially it could do some damage to the equipment, possibly, or certainly take the thing offline and cause issues for the power grid or whatever. So yeah, this has the potential to be kind of serious.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, we talked about it even just a little bit ago about you really want a layered security model, and the notion of being able to protect this through VPN services. In fact, I would expect that in a lot of these wind turbines located out in the field somewhere, I don't know, I guess they're electrically connected anyway, so they might not it might not be a big deal to wire it in. But I think in some of these remote sensors, Internet of Things, the tendency is to want to use a mobility network to connect it. And there are in fact services so that you can get basically on a closed network to be able to help protect the sort of the perimeter around those devices and minimize the potential of exposure if there is a vulnerability of this sort. All right, well, thanks for bringing that, Jim. That's a good topic. So let's go to you, Matt. And Stan talked about one flavor of denial of service attack. And actually, this might be sort of a little bit related, right?
Sort of a little bit related, sure. So this is a pretty fascinating story. There's an organization called Great Fire. They're an anti-censorship organization that focuses mostly on the censorship within China. And as such, they're a regular target of Chinese interest, we'll just say that. Recently, their website's gone under DDoS attack. And shortly thereafter, some of their pages on GitHub were also under DDoS attack by a huge amount of attackers. And now GitHub is calling this the biggest DDoS they've ever seen. So this is significant. The interesting part about the attack is the sources of the traffic, because it seems that these are just normal users. And through a little bit of investigation, Great Fire has shown that the sources of the traffic are visitors to websites that have assets that use Baidu, which is a Chinese search engine. They also have something called Baidu Analytics, which is similar to Google Analytics. If you're a website owner, you insert a little bit of JavaScript code in your site, and it tracks usage of the site for you by who visits. Apparently, somewhere along the path between these users' computers and the Baidu servers, that Baidu Analytics code is being intercepted and replaced with JavaScript that causes a number of requests to be made against these target servers.
Bizarre.
Really bizarre and kind of amazing.
Yeah.
So from what they've reported is that about 1% of users are being redirected, at least that bit of the code is being redirected to this attack code. It's being basically manipulated in line. And so the assertion there is that this is some aspect of the Great Firewall being used to not just censor traffic, but actually actively manipulate it to turn visitors to sites into DDoS participants, which is a pretty hefty claim.
Yeah.
But it also kind of
Unknowingly.
Ongoing.
Unknowingly.
Oh, unknowingly. Yes, this is
That
true.
too.
Well, that's a good point because GitHub, I guess, has been in communications with Great Fire because it was GitHub's hosting the content. It belongs to Great Fire. They've been coordinating. GitHub has actually inserted their own warning messages into sites. So if you end up at Baidu and that attack code is in there somewhere, it makes a request to GitHub servers. And what will happen is the request to GitHub will come back with GitHub's own injected code that says you're visiting a site that may be compromised. You should probably worry about this. Now these are all plain text sites. If you were using SSL, you probably wouldn't have this opportunity to inject the code in there, which, if you want to use that as an excuse to start saying people should start encrypting everything, that's one argument for it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the thing that boggles my mind here is, we talk a little bit about attribution. Now, this is a case where I suspect the attribution has a lot to do with circumstantial information or evidence, as opposed to, you can't, how do you trace that back? How do you define who the attacker is in a case like that? Well, that's a really tricky one.
The interesting part is somebody actually has done it, and that's URL query, which I know we're all familiar with as a website that if you go to it, you browse to it, you give it a URL, it'll go and check it out. Apparently, it passes through that same sort of, whatever manipulation is occurring, and their logs indicate the contents of that JS file that keeps coming back. And they can see this is the attack code, and this is the site I tried to visit, and this is what came back.
Right. Okay.
So it shows the manipulation in action.
You can see that, but where did the code come from? How do you know?
Well, there's no, yeah, that's the thing. I don't
Yeah.
think there's any, I'm not clear on this. There may not be a particular server that it's reaching out to get. It may exist somewhere in the memory of the devices that are doing this inline manipulation. In which case, you're right, you wouldn't have evidence anywhere but in these interstitial devices.
Yeah. Certainly a tricky one. I mean, I don't. This is. I think it just really kind of broadens your mind in terms of the levels of indirection and tricks that can be that can be
It was
conveyed.
interesting to me the strategy that you said GitHub took with the re-injection of other code back to the users. I just
Well, it's their own site. They can return whatever they want to. So if you've ever been to a website where someone was, hot linking an image, and it would eventually be replaced by, this site is not authorized to use this image, they may be using the refer
similar
header,
technology, something like that.
something like that, to figure out where the request is supposed to be coming from, and then say, we need to worry about this, return something different.
But it's a very creative solution, I think.
It's in general, it's a pretty creative solution on both sides. The one thing that worries me is that you've got, but if the claims are true that this is 1% of the traffic, imagine if 100% of the traffic was manipulated. Take any major website, and then if you can own the infrastructure around it, and you can inject your own content into what comes back, you can turn any visitor into an unknowing participant in an attack.
Right.
At huge scales.
Yeah, I wonder how scalable it is. Yeah, you got to imagine if it was really true that that could be done, it's probably not trivial to establish that at scale. Maybe they figured it out.
Well, and I think part of it is going to be understanding what's going on is, I think, an important part to be able to generate a defense against it. So this is, I think this is something that's probably worth some additional investigation and how it could develop going forward. And we're not, I guess, Matt, you have another one that has its own little nuances and complexities here.
Sure. So I just keep finding the interesting stories, in my opinion. I'll spread them out a little bit more next time. But this is an article from Symantec. They're talking about a spam campaign on Twitter using fake accounts. And this is kind of unique in that it's a very, very large spam campaign of about 75,000 Twitter bots.
Wow.
In coordinated action. Now, because it's Twitter and because I guess security researchers have a sense of humor, if they've broken down the 3 tiers of actors of bots into mockingbirds, parrots, and eggs. Mockingbirds being basically the primary source of spam content. So this would be the one account that says, "Hey, brand new green coffee weight loss supplements. This is awesome. Get it while you can." And they usually are designed to mimic very popular accounts in their own right. So if it looks like MTV or some celebrity or something like that someone could ostensibly mistake for a real valuable account or follow-worthy account. So they're at the top of the chain. Then you've got parrots, which they found were almost always accounts using photographs of women that were following and retweeting that Mockingbird account. So they're basically the echo chamber for these. So as they build their own networks, they retweet this information. Other people maybe will start following them, legitimate users, and amplify that effect. And this is where the spam spreads.
Right. Right.
Then you've got your eggs, which are basically just blank accounts. Then if anybody uses Twitter, you know that a blank, unset up account has an egg as its icon, which is where the name comes from. But these are sort of the backup accounts. Whenever either your Mockingbird or your parrot accounts get taken out, there's a hierarchy of progression where parrots become mockingbirds, eggs become parrots. And the vast majority of the accounts that are being used are these reserve accounts, these eggs. Like something like 95% of the accounts that they found associated with this activity are just sitting around waiting to be used.
Wow.
Which is a huge number of fake accounts to be sort of in the wings. But it shows that the lengths that these guys are willing to go to just to send some spam about supplements.
And who says there aren't creative people in this world today? I mean, seriously.
Right?
Yeah, so I kind of wonder to what extent this kind of thing can translate into Facebook or other social media, that and whether there are controls sufficiently in place to be able to. I think the one thing with Twitter is it tends to be a little bit more open in terms of discovery. than Facebook is, at least at this point. But I'm not sure to what extent it translates. It'd be an interesting thing to think about.
There's a couple of points there. One is Twitter does verify those kind of celebrity accounts. So, if you're not paying attention, maybe you'll be fooled, but if you're aware of, this is Celebrity A's official account, a new one shows up that says, I'm Celebrity A, but it's not verified, it's not as effective. Facebook, I think they still do this. They will, if anytime you link off of the site, they'll ask you, are you sure you want to go to site name here? So that's sort of will slow you down a bit and make you think, do I really want to go to this external site, even though, fake celebrity told me to? But I guess the same principles of building the social network around a single, follow-worthy account and all the echo chambers surrounding that are probably pretty similar. So I don't see why you couldn't do it.
So any idea what the countermeasure is that Twitter's?
Well, Symantec's speaking with Twitter about it. They've been working this on the back end. I think they've got a way of correlating these accounts and knowing the creator. I assume if you start changing these accounts by who registered them or where from, you can start evading those mechanisms as well. But I think social graph analysis is probably the right way to go about it, to try and figure out, have we suddenly seen, you've got a top tier account that is a little bit questionable, but all of a sudden everybody's following it and retweeting everything that they say. You might be able to suss those cores out. Hopefully.
I think a couple of weeks ago, maybe it was last week, you talked a little bit about CAPTCHA.
Yeah.
And making it into a game instead of the funky characters. But perhaps that's a way that even if you can identify suspect accounts, you mentioned these are bots, that is some of the echoing that's going on is being automated, I presume?
I assume so, but the thing about that is Twitter is so integrated with so many other platforms at this point. And basically, the Twitter API allows you to post as somebody from TweetDeck or some other software.
So I guess what I was thinking is in terms of supplementing correlation analysis, that is, once you find a suspect ones, it gives you an opportunity to put some things in. But I guess your point was well taken. If there's the intent to be able to facilitate automation, then that would put a little bit of a hiccup in things.
You might be able to do it at the account creation time, so you can't just massively sign up for these things. Now, there are services out there that you can definitely pay. I was going through some of my old notes, and I noticed there's one called Death by CAPTCHA. Apparently, you can just pay someone to solve CAPTCHAs for you all day.
Oh, that is true, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean,
it can be.
They're all partial solutions.
There are always countermeasures for it. Okay. Well, that's certainly a mind-boggling one in itself. So thanks for bringing that. Let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here, and. Matt, you were taking a little bit of a look at this one. I think we're still trying to get our head around what might be going on here. But port 4143 and port 4183 UDP showed up. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting. They showed up at practically the same instant. If you take a look at the graph, you can see that, the spikes start at the same time. We took a look at the sources, and I can't remember which one is which. I believe that the smaller spikes there are indicative of ones outside of the United States as sources, and the huge spikes are ones that are within the United States. It may just be a question of the vantage point that we have for this traffic. I'm not sure.
I don't know. Looked pretty biased to me.
Okay.
Yeah. So the observation was that in port 4143 that appeared to be predominantly U.S. based. And there were a couple of little exceptions, but the geographic mapping for IP addresses isn't perfectly accurate anyway. And then for 4183, it seemed like it was almost exclusively outside U.S., South America and Europe and Asia. And so I guess that's where it appears that, and the other aspect of this is that it appears that this is P2P activity. Packet size is fixed. It always has an ephemeral port going toward one of these other ports, 4183 or 4143. So my suspicion is, and I guess the other aspect of this, we saw some of the sources. It looked like perhaps Internet of Things type devices that were perhaps compromised. A lot of them demonstrating the ROM pager web server. And so that would suggest perhaps that, and that's is that the 7543 port?
7547, yeah.
Oh, 47, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's 7547 TCP. And so when you have that's not that popular of a port. If it's showing up on there with a large majority of these items, it's probably associated with that. There was a vulnerability disclosed for ROM pager in December. The vulnerability was disclosed in December. and it was an authentication bypass. So that perhaps is a mechanism or an avenue that's being used here to get into devices, infect them, and I suspect the setting up a peer-to-peer network. And there may be some motivation for the regional separation. And in fact, there perhaps may be other ports that we haven't discovered yet that are covering other regions or some other purpose. So anyway, if you see this sort of activity on your network, you probably want to investigate that a little bit further and see perhaps if it's an indication of this activity having leaked into your network. And Stan, this was the one that you referred to earlier, that is scan sources on various proxy ports, I guess is what we're graphing here, but the one that's really up and on top here is port 8080. You know, we talk a lot about scanning activities, and some of the ones that are shown here, by the way, port 3128 is shown here, 3159, and then 8123. I wasn't familiar with that particular one. Stan, you may, sorry, Matt, I'm calling you Stan again. You were looking at the ports here. I guess you dug up some popular proxy ports to show in this graph.
Yep.
You know, what's actually notable here is in the last week or so, there was actually a pretty significant increase on the number of sources scanning on port 8080, and it kind of feeds into that notion that perhaps a lot of this, or at least some of this scanning activity looking for proxies would be perhaps to help anonymize denial of service attacks. But you know, we're speculating on that particular fact, but there certainly is a lot of scanning activity going on, or a lot of sources doing that. Taking a look at the most probed ports, the top 10 of those, that is, port 135 TCP, still a head scratcher on that one. I guess for some reason somebody has found that to be lucrative, and so they're continuing to scan for port 135, followed by port 22 TCP, 443 TCP, 23 TCP, and then well, I guess it looks like, I just wanted to mention, I guess 443 hasn't moved much. 1900 UDP, that would be associated with reflective denial of service attack activity. 445, that continues to move down, that's kind of a good sign. 80 TCP, and then 8080. 8080 we've just taken a look at. 3389, remote desktop protocol, and then 53 UDP. And the other part of the pie seems to be getting bigger, which suggests that there are a lot of other ports that are a significant contribution to the whole here. But keep in mind, it's just the top 10 ports that represents roughly 60% of the total. So that's a meaningful observation in itself. Looking in terms of the most sources doing that probing, of course, we had just looked at port 8080 as a part of that, which was a contributor, but doesn't show up on this graph. And then, well, I guess we're starting to see some growth in the port 4143 and port 4183. Still doesn't show up in this graph, but
4143 does show up.
Oh, it does show up. Yeah, thank you. So 445 at the top of the list, followed by port 23, and so we've been watching the port 23 go down. I suspect it's kind of flattened out here. It hasn't really moved since the last week or so. 27015 UDP and 6881 UDP, both associated with P2P networking activity. We have some ICMP ports in here. 4143 does show up at looks like number 8 there, and then 1900 UDP again, simple service discovery protocol associated with distributed reflection denial of service attack activity. That's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at threattrack@list.att.com, and you can follow us on Twitter. You can get notice of new episodes on Twitter. It's at ATT Security. And the ThreatTraq video is available on att.com/ThreatTraq, as well as on and that would be the AT&T Tech channel, as well as on YouTube, and it's available in an audio version on iTunes. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Stan. Thanks, Matt. Thank you, Jim. I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode, and until then, keep your network safe.